I'm so excited to be hosting this Friends at Home event. We're delighted to have author Robin Sloan join us tonight. My name is Karen Manuel. I'm a member of the board of directors of the Friends of the Alameda Free Library in Alameda, California. The Friends is a nonprofit organization. We raise money and advocate for our city's public library. The pandemic inspired us to take our community programs virtual. We've been delighted by the popularity of our virtual events, and we love being able to connect with you and share common experiences. The pandemic also inspired us to add a used bookstore to our alamedafriends.com website. The site offers used books and grab bags by genre with bicycle delivery on the island. We are able to provide these programs through the support of our donors. We ask that you consider a donation to the Friends in any comfortable to you via our website, alamedafriends.com. Now for a few technical details. During the event, at times, you'll see Robin's presentation on the screen and Robin in a small window. If the small window ever interferes with your being able to see Robin's presentation, you can click on it and move it around the screen. Your audio and video are turned off. Please use to ask questions, and I'll read your questions to Robin when he finishes his presentation. We ask that you act with respect in your chat comments. Any violations could result in you being removed from the audience. We've worked hard to hone our Zoom skills, but we occasionally have glitches. If this happens, please be patient with us. We strive to create a great experience for everyone. Now, onto our program. I'm delighted to welcome Robin Sloan tonight. He is the author of Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore, a New York Times bestseller, and Sourdough, as well as a number of novellas and short stories that you can find on Robin's website, robinsloan.com. Robin's stories are a wacky mix of adventure, humor, history, technology, and fantasy. His writing often incorporates places familiar to locals. Tonight, he'll be discussing some of those locations, no doubt with a quirky twist. Now, I turn the program over to Robin. Welcome, Robin.
Karen, thank you so much. What an absolute honor to be here and a delight. I think this will not come as a surprise to longtime viewers of these events from the Alameda Free Library, but I can just say, as someone invited to do it, the whole team behind the scenes, Karen, David, and another Karen, are literally the best I've ever worked with in putting these kind of events together. So it's just a pleasure to be here. Now, in conversation with them about what I would talk about tonight, and mindful of the fact that this is an event with the Alameda Free Library, I wanted to sort of honor the specificity of this venue. So rather than give like the generic library talk, which is very good, you know, it's not a bad generic talk, I want to do something more specific. And I know that not all, but many of you will be tuning in from Alameda, from around the Bay Area. So I thought this would be a great opportunity to talk about here, you know, this place where I'm standing now. I'm right on the border of Oakland and Berkeley, kind of where they smash into Emeryville down by the train tracks. Of course, these kind of hopping through these connections in Alameda. And this place has been not just important, but, you know, decisive, foundational for me and for all my writing. So I'm going to talk about this place, and I want to make 4 stops. Each one is a time and a place that's linked to a specific book that I've written. And so I hope this will be interesting to people who have read those books, but also to people who haven't, who just live here or even just know this place, as well as people who are perhaps more broadly curious about how place informs fiction and how it kind of threads its way into these stories. And that includes, you know, I'm sure there are writers, real or aspiring, out there in the audience. And so if you're wondering for yourself how your environment can kind of work its way into this craft, you know, with luck, I'll say 1 or 2 things that might actually be useful to you. So 4 stops, and then there will be time for your questions. And of course, those questions at the end can be about this presentation, or they can be about my books or writing more generally. I am at your disposal. So let's see, the first stop. So first, Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore. That's my first novel. And it is rooted in San Francisco, and in particular in the 2000s tech sublime. And here, I just want to take a moment and underscore for people who are maybe lifelong Bay Area residents, or you were born and raised here, or you've lived here a long time, and so it all seems natural. I want to just underscore how strange and powerful the atmosphere of the Bay Area was and kind of still is to a transplant from the Midwest. I came here in 2004. And for me, someone coming from a world that was a little more conservative, not in a political sense, but maybe in a kind of career sense, in a sense of putting together your life and deciding what to do, to come to the Bay Area was, I mean, it literally just like knocked the lid off of my head and reached in and kind of pulped up my brains inside. There was this sense of invention, of possibility, and I would say a relationship to failure, sort of a celebration of failure almost, that was completely unprecedented and to me transformative. So one of the things I want to talk about this whole, in a way, this first place that connects to this first book, Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore, is really the whole Bay Area, but it's in particular, you can imagine it almost as an axis, you know, a line with two nodes. One of those nodes is the city of San Francisco, and the other node is Silicon Valley. You've got sort of computation, and you also have the counterculture. And this is the thing I kind of want to zoom in on here and just really, I take every chance I can get to reaffirm it and like make sure this piece of Silicon Valley history, tech history, never gets lost. It is rooted in the counterculture of the Bay Area. You know, in the 60s and 70s, many of the same people exactly are interested in new ways of living and thinking, and also interested in new ways of computing and new ways of linking computers together. Just to take one example, and I mean, truly, it's a grab bag. You could choose one of hundreds, probably thousands of people, really, really important people. But just to choose one who's my favorite, you've got Stuart Brand. He's founder of the Whole Earth Catalog, one of the great, great, great Bay Area minds. And in the 1960s, he's in two places. He's actually in more than two places, but these two places at least. One, Ken Kesey is organizing his famous acid tests in San Francisco, and there is Stuart Brand literally handing out samples of LSD so people can like have their minds blown. Two, a different person, a different brainiac, Douglas Engelbart, is putting on an incredible futuristic technology demonstration. It was a big production, actually. They held it and they recorded it and kind of televised it, a huge screen at the Bill Graham Civic Auditorium. Today, it's legendary in the world of computing. It's called the mother of all demos. And it's like a prophecy of the world we live in. You know, in this demonstration, he's talking to his computer. He's, you know, talking to other internet connected computers. He's moving things around in windows. It's incredible. We know this because it's recorded, you know, it was on camera. And there, behind the camera, was Stuart Brand. Same person, two places, obviously this shared interest and this link between them, this really important line from the computational to the countercultural. And, you know, this spirit, I think, has waxed and waned over the Bay Area's whole history, kind of starting in the 1950s and continuing on since then. But I can report to you that in the 2000s, in a way, in sort of the wreckage of the 2000 tech bubble, it was very strong. It was very strong indeed. And it was so astonishing to me and so interesting that I literally started taking notes. I mean, I was writing down the things I was feeling. I was writing down notes about the people I was encountering who seemed like characters out of novels in their like weirdness and intensity. And so two things happened. One is I put that axis, that link between San Francisco and Silicon Valley, kind of that ping pong journey back and forth. I put that into my first novel, Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore. And the second thing that happened is I only wrote that novel because of that spirit and because of that atmosphere. You know, that was the thing that made me think that writing a novel where I had not written one before would even be possible. Just that spirit of invention and being okay with failure and maybe starting small to build to something bigger. You know, the novel actually started as a short story, not even as a short story I sent to a literary magazine or anything traditional, but one that I just published myself on my own little website. So that's our first stop. And I think that in a way frames everything that's going to come next. It's that really, really important axis, that just incredibly powerful thread through the culture and history of the Bay Area in the way that it became the reason I'm talking to you here now. You know, if I had not moved here from Michigan and if I had not imbibed at this different kind of acid test, you know, if I had not drank that Kool-Aid, then I would not be standing here. There would be no reason for me to be invited by the Alameda Free Library. Okay, onward now to our second stop. And here we're going to zoom way back in time. This is connected to a novella I wrote. It's sort of a loose prequel to that first novel. Its title is Ajax Penumbra, 1969. Now, in that story, there's a really important book, of course, a mysterious artifact, and it's hidden away. It's been, there's a minor spoiler, but I kind of have to say it. It's been buried in a ship that's kind of part of the foundation of San Francisco. And it's been buried there, impenetrable for more than a century. And it's in this story set in 1969, when the BART tunnel is first being excavated, that it becomes possible to reach this book and retrieve it. And, you know, of course, adventure and mystery ensues. But I want to talk about those ships. So this is a real thing. And I suspect that some people on this call tuned in will know about this already, but for those who don't, it is very important that I tell you about these ships. So here's the story. It's the gold rush, right? This incredible, just actually, even now, this unimaginable boom time in San Francisco history, when people are being drawn like iron filings to a magnet from all around the world, because they've been told there's just wealth lying on the ground, waiting to be picked up in the Sierras. And San Francisco is the sort of faucet through which it's flowing both ways. So people are coming over, they're coming by ship, of course, because it's like the 19th century, and these ship journeys are very, very long. So they book passage on, you know, whatever freighter or passenger ship, or, you know, who knows what it is. And they're talking about the gold the entire way. They're telling the stories that they've heard, you know, maybe their cousin's brother's hairdresser found a big lump of gold and now he's rich. And so they're just like dreaming of this stuff and talking about it nonstop. And keep in mind, these joint voyages took a very long time. So the crews of these ships are hearing this and they start to get excited too. And this happens again and again and again for all these ships kind of steaming in or sailing in, I guess, to San Francisco at this time. By the time they reach the city, these sailors, who are, I'm sure, not that well paid and not that comfortable in their current posts, they also decide they're going to go for the gold rush. Like, how dopey, like what kind of dopes are they? Are they going to keep sailing back and forth around South America? No way. They want the free money. So the ships come in, they drop their anchor, and they empty out. And so a characteristic scene in San Francisco Bay at this time in history is just a flotilla of abandoned ships. Perfectly good, functional, you know, seaworthy, but nobody wants to sail them because they're too busy getting rich, or they think they're going to be too busy getting rich. So these ships become a nuisance for sort of an intermediate time period. They actually get sort of transformed into other things. Some, as you'd expect, are boarding houses, brothels. It's a little unclear. I'd like to imagine there was at least one floating bookstore. Probably not. So they kind of become civic infrastructure for a while there. But, you know, a ship is not really meant to do that, and it's not very convenient. And soon, a better use presents itself. Because San Francisco, the boomtown, is growing. Literally, they decide there ought to be more San Francisco. As it happens, there has recently been an enormous disaster producing a huge amount of rubble, just wrecked, charred wood and stone and dirt, and they got to get rid of it. So they say, let's sort of kill two birds with one stone. Let's clean up, and let's also extend the shoreline. Let's make ourselves some more San Francisco. This will be great. They look at those ships, many of which are probably half sunk at this point already. I mean, kind of just decomposing in the water. They see them, perhaps appropriately, as garbage, and they say, throw those in too. So I'm going to show you if I can do this correctly, I'm going to show you a map right now. And this is an amazing, amazing map, just an incredible work of scholarship. It's going to show you San Francisco, where the original shoreline was, where the shoreline today is. You're going to see there's quite a gap. And let's see, I'll go to my desktop. We can see the locations of some of these ships. Because of course we found them, digging the foundations of big skyscrapers, digging BART tunnels, all sorts of things. people have found traces of these hulls kind of encased, entombed in the dirt. And so, we have right at the base of the Transamerica Pyramid, the Niantic, incredible. The Apollo, the General Harrison, the William Gray, you can see over here kind of on the east side of the bay. I took the name William Gray specifically for my book. And so they lined this whole area here, this really, really large and significant swath of San Francisco that did not exist. So that's the story. Those are the sunken, buried ships of San Francisco, traces of the boomtown greed and madness. And I learned about that some amount of time ago, probably reading a book or something online. And I hope it's obvious to you that I found it so delicious. I wrote it down, something like that. It's adventurous, it's ghostly, it's like a secret sort of hidden in plain sight in this city. And I just thought, I gotta use this somehow. And so I did use it ultimately in the book. The important thing is that when I wrote it down, I did not know how it was going to fit into a story, or really if it could fit into a story. I just knew it had that flavor. And I think as you write more and more fiction over time, you learn to sort of recognize that flavor. It just tastes like mystery or tastes like an adventure. So that's the story about how some material is so good that it has to get used, even if you don't know how, even if you don't know when, even if it takes 10 years or 20 years or longer of waiting, that story is going to make its way out of your notebook and onto the page. And that's what happened with the sunken ghost ships from the gold rush. So that's our second stop. Our third stop is rooted in Sourdough. That's my newer novel published in 2017. And this third stop is the Navy base on Alameda. So this is very close to home for this event. I'm sure it'll be very familiar to some of the people listening in, tuned in today. Of course, it was decommissioned some time ago and has had a whole sort of, arc of reimagining and redevelopment. And there's many, many things still underway now, even as all this incredible activity has kind of moved in, almost like hermit crabs, moving into an old abandoned shell. There's, distilling, and there's a brewery, and there's people who make things and all sorts of stuff. I'm going to show you a map. I guarantee, or I am very confident that you've never seen this particular map of Alameda before. But before I show it to you, I want to tell you a story. This is another story that found its way sort of inevitably, but still surprisingly into my fiction. So this was it might even have been before 2012. It was sometime in let's say, the late 2000s. I was invited to a very interesting event on Alameda at the Navy base. And at that point, I had been in Alameda a few times before, but I definitely didn't know it well. And I didn't know the scene at the Navy base at all. I'd never been out there. The invitation was to a nerd movie night at the headquarters of a small company called Squid Labs. And I didn't know anyone at Squid Labs. I guess I had been invited by a friend of a friend, but a nerd movie night at a headquarters of a place called Squid Labs sounded pretty good to me, so I went. I drove out, kind of, finding my way. I don't even know if I was following GPS. I might have printed out directions at that point. And I'm driving out, sort of winding my way through Alameda, through the Navy base, and trying to make sense of what I'm seeing. Now, again, as many of you know, the hangars have been made into other things. The support buildings have been made into other things. However, there's one particular building that any Navy base probably has, usually only one. And you got to ask yourself, what becomes of that one building? And that one building is the control tower, right there standing on the runway, and the little, squat building next to it. The answer, at least at that time in the history of the repurposed Navy base, was that the control tower was the headquarters of Squid Labs. So I'm following my directions, kind of disbelieving, like, wait, down this road? This is the road. Can that be it? They got the control tower. It was unbelievable. It was a dream. It was the ultimate nerd checkmate. So I pull up to whatever parking they had set up. I got out. I went in. Packed house. Lots of stuff going on. Foosball tables in full effect. They had Ghostbusters up on a big projected wall there. It was a complete scene. And again, to kind of, I think all these things are going to connect together in different ways, but you connect that back to that spirit, that San Francisco, Silicon Valley spirit, that just wacky, dreamy, energetic fearlessness. Like that was distilled there truly in that scene at that control tower. At one point, I remember this so vividly. I walked up the stairs to, through the control tower itself to the deck, the place where, Navy officers used to talk to pilots and, guide them in and also tell them when they could take off. There in the actual sort of glass bubble of the control tower. It was a little bit junky. They had put up some knickknacks, but they also had a kegerator where you could pour yourself a cold plastic cup of beer and then just stand and look out across the sort of bedraggled, kind of junked up runway, Alameda, and of course the whole bay beyond. And it was awesome. It was a totally awesome scene. So, I mean, really, maybe you feel this yourself hearing about that scene. It was almost too Bay Area to handle. It was this kind of condensation or like distillation of this particular energy. And whenever you run across something like that in real life, it's a sign that it probably belongs in a novel, because that's kind of what novels are too, right? They take real things, but then they sort of compress them, and maybe they sort of mutate them or even kind of turn up the weirdness from a normal 6 or 7 all the way up to 10 or 11. So here before me was a real occurring event or scene that had kind of done that naturally. So of course I wanted to just take it and use it for myself. So if any of you have read my novel Sourdough, you know that the control tower and that airfield is a very important setting in the book. I won't say too much about what it does for folks who haven't read the book, but I do want to share a pretty cool image. So I'm going to share my screen again. And now let me go to downloads. Here we go. So this map is the world of Sourdough. And I'm very, very, very proud of this map. This appears on the first page, right before the title page, actually, in the novel Sourdough. And this shows people, where is this all happening? There's a few things I want to say about this map. One, to me, it frames the Bay Area correctly, because of course this looks like the map you find on the front page of a fantasy novel. So you're going to learn about the land of Middle Earth or Narnia or Threnodil or something, and you need to know that like the Skull Mountains are up in the northeast and the Kingdom of the Elves is down on the coast in the west. And this is that kind of map. It has that position in the book and that feeling. And its fantastical land of magic and adventure is, of course, just the Bay Area, which is sort of right. It was actually drawn for the book by Jeffrey Ward, who's really got a lock on the market for these kind of fictional or novelistic maps. In fact, he's the one who drew the original maps for the Game of Thrones book by George R.R. Martin. So I was pretty, starstruck to have him draw this. And the other thing that's important about this map, and the thing that I felt this pretty deeply as kind of a service to readers, and this connects to place in fiction and the way they relate. I'm sure I'm not alone in reading books set in other places that I know a little but not well. New York City among them, Paris, even Los Angeles. And because they're good novels, they dive into the nuance, the details of this place, and they name specific intersections, and they talk very offhandedly about, oh, it's across the river, it's through the tunnel. And of course, I never know what they're talking about. I don't know those places that well. Part of the pleasure of fiction is you just go along with it. You kind of nod and say, sure, I can imagine that there's something across the tunnel, or I can imagine, that that's over there. It sounds like the characters think it's a long way away. But you don't read it the way that a New Yorker reads it, or somebody really, really deep in the culture of Los Angeles reads it. And particularly for the Bay Area, and not just San Francisco, the whole Bay Area. Sourdough is really an East Bay book. I had this vision of people reading it, running across these place names, not just Alameda, but like North Berkeley BART and the ferry, between San Francisco and Alameda. And just it not clicking. It's sort of staying in that hazy space of abstraction. And so it was as if my sentences were like, she went from place to place. And of course, that's not what I meant. I meant specific places with a specific relationship, especially across the body of this bay, which I think is very adventurous and kind of dramatic. So I said to my publisher, we must have a map. And happily, they went along with it. And so as a result, everyone who read this book, even the people who don't know anything about the Bay Area, they've never even imagined there was a place called Alameda or a point on a map that could correspond to North Berkeley BART. Now they know where all that stuff is. And if they get confused midway through, they can kind of flip back and they can check. So that's our third stop, the Bay Area, a fantastical land where dragons roam. Here's our fourth and final stop. This summer, in the midst of the confusion and stress and just kind of dissipation, sort of atomization of the pandemic, the first wave of that, I did something that I'm very proud of, and really for me it was the absolute highlight. In some ways, it was the redemption of the year 2020 for me, and that was I wrote a newspaper serial, a classic, old-fashioned serialized story published in the San Jose Mercury News and the East Bay Times, one episode every day for 2 weeks. It had a little spot on the bottom of the front page, a couple of really lovely illustrations, and it was an absolute ball. The title of this serialized story, which was sort of a sci-fi mystery, was Annabelle Scheme and the Adventure of the New Golden Gate. Annabelle Scheme, of course, being my detective. She's into things that are sort of spooky, but also sort of high-tech. A core element of this story, the story kind of bounces between worlds, between possible Bay areas, and it turns out there's sort of a mystery that implicates several of them and pits a few different versions of our history against each other. The sort of centerpiece of that, the thing that splits these timelines and makes them enemies, is a real thing from history, a real thing from the history of the Bay Area. And this, like the ghost ships of the San Francisco coast, is something I think a fair number of people listening to this will know about, but some won't, and it is critical that you know about it. And this something is called the Reber Plan. Now, this is the brainchild of someone named John Reber, and at its core, I'll show you the map in a moment, at its core is a sense of sort of offense. You think of yourself as a big brain person who really believes in like industry and progress, and the year is 1949, and you live in the Bay Area and you look out across the bay and it just offends you. It's emptiness. You see it's like a donut, a hole in the middle of a donut of industrial potential and wealth and innovation and science and life, and there in the middle, nothing. How can we live like this? John Reber asked himself and the world in the late 1940s. So he came up with a plan. Brace yourself. I'm going to show you the Reber Plan right now. Share screen. It's so horrifying and wonderful. So this is the Reber Plan. John Reber wanted to fill in the bay. I mean, it's simple as that. You can just say it in a few words. The portions in red of this map are places where they would just continue the program begun so long ago in San Francisco and bulldoze a whole bunch of dirt and junk into the water, thus changing the boundary of the bay. Not only that, though, they would go further, because this is the 20th century and we can do big things. They would extend the coastline, especially in the East Bay, but then additionally, they would build these tremendous locks and barriers, basically in sort of the north and south barriers, kind of edges of the innermost bay, and they would prevent the transfusion of ocean water and fresh water, because of course that's what the bay is. It's a place where kind of the runoff of California, Northern California, meets the ocean. The Reber Plan says, nope, not anymore. Instead, we have this sort of salty inner bay that's cut off from what would become freshwater lakes, reservoirs to the north and south. Okay, so just look at this map a little bit more. Really take it in. I can find myself here if you trace the kind of white border of the land on the right side of the map. You see where it says Berkeley, and then you kind of go down and you see Berkeley Marina. A little further down is the little nubbin of Emeryville Marina. And I'm not too far north of that. And just look at that block of red that would have extended out and out and out, but only to the ship channel. Don't worry. Okay, so this was a real thing. And I mean, for anyone who didn't know about the Reber Plan, your life has just been improved. You really don't know how. This plan was seriously discussed for decades, in fact. Of course, from the very beginning, some people thought it was absurd. From the very beginning, a lot of people thought it was interesting. John Reber was the champion, but he wouldn't have made any progress if at least some other people, industrialists and sort of believers in progress and expansion, didn't say, well, at least we should consider it. In fact, it was so serious that this plan is the reason the Bay model, which you can visit in Sausalito, exists. it was made by the Army Corps of Engineers to test the sort of hydrological dynamics of this proposal. Spoiler alert, it doesn't work. They made the model, and there were some other reports and stuff done. This all kind of spans into like the late 50s. Not even I guess it's the early 50s. They do these reports, and all the hydrologists and scientists all agree, this is not going to work. I mean, it's just that those lakes, the top and bottom, they'll be half full most of the time. When they are full, they'll be polluted and stagnant and disgusting. It's actually a pretty dystopian view. So it's easy to make fun of this, and we should make fun of this because it's that classic high modern big brain of sort of industry and like these big projects of the mid 20th century without literally any thought for things like ecology or human life, to say nothing of sort of beauty and all the things that bring value that are not shipping channels. But I think it's important, while we sort of make fun of it and laugh about it, to go back to those ghost ships and remember that this is not new. And to remember that the San Francisco that we love, that many of us love, some of those places, the Transamerica Pyramid, that whole waterfront, the whole sort of financial district and downtown of San Francisco, the ferry building, for my money, one of the most beautiful, almost utopian places in this country to walk and have a coffee and eat a croissant. Those places would not have existed if they had not done at that time in miniature exactly what John Reber was proposing about a century later. I mean, that's important. The office that brought me to San Francisco, the first place I worked and the reason I moved out here at all, that was built on that fill. It wouldn't have been there without that idea, without that sensibility. The office, my last office in San Francisco, the place where I wrote a big chunk of my novel Sourdough, that wouldn't have existed. It sat on that fill. So that kind of brings us to our last stop, and then we'll turn it back over to Karen and your questions. Building on that sort of analysis of the Reber Plan, I want to give you my grand theory of the Bay Area. Not all of you will like this, I don't think, and that's okay. I just ask that you hear it and sort of let it sit. I think that the Bay Area is fundamentally the forever boomtown. It was forged in this way. And ever since that sort of, first cause of the riches of the gold rush, every version of the whole Bay Area, not just San Francisco, has destroyed, almost eaten up the version that came before. Of course, they all leave their traces. There's it's like a palimpsest, a painting that gets changed and scraped off and repainted. You can't actually eradicate what's underneath. And of course, this is the story of cities everywhere. But here, it just seems supercharged. That power, the force of those transformations, and in some cases, the degree to which they annihilate the thing that came before. So it's the most natural thing of all. I mean, it's totally human. And I think it's actually a good thing to love the Bay Area that you came into, whether that's the one you were born into or whether that's the one you came of age in. Maybe it's the one you moved to. I mean, I think that's true for a lot of people. It's true for me. My Bay Area, my forever Bay Area in some ways is like the Bay Area of the year 2005. I don't know, maybe that's depressing. You're allowed to love that Bay Area. I think it's important to do that. But I think at the same time, it is absolutely critical. It's almost a moral imperative that you remember the place you love destroyed some other place. And other people, they love that place. And this goes all the way back to the beginning. I mean, it actually goes even before the gold rush, right? This goes all the way back to the Ohlone and their sort of utopian lives eating, oysters and acorns and salmon, some of the all-time great lives here on the shore of the San Francisco Bay. And I think that sense of kind of destruction and recreation should give us for sure a sense of humility and just realizing that we are one link in a chain, or kind of maybe it's one cycle, one piston stroke in a combustion engine. But I also think it should give us, among other things, a sense of curiosity, always an openness to the future, even if it includes wacky ideas like extending the shoreline or building new buildings or more houses. I think it should also give us a sense of generosity, a sense of sharing this place with other people, including people who don't live here yet, people who've never even dreamt of living here, people who haven't even been born. I just don't think it's permissible to say, no, I think we should stop the clock for the whole Bay Area on December 1st, 1968, or March 11th, 1984. Nope, that's it. That's when it was good. October 1st, 2004. That's just about when I moved to San Francisco. That's the right version. You can stop it right here. I don't think you can do that. But I should say, in closing, that's my last remark, and then we can go over to Q&A. I do think that finally, one of the things that literature can do, art of all kinds, but literature in particular, is it can capture and celebrate all these different particular versions. Almost like a mosquito trapped in amber. It's not as good as the real thing. Nothing's as good as the real thing, but it's not nothing. And I think it becomes a lovely commemoration and a lovely artifact in a way for people who maybe didn't get to know these places at these times to get to enjoy them. So that's what I hope I did at least a little bit with all these books that I've discussed. So that's it for me. Thank you so much. And I am totally delighted now to turn to your questions, whatever they are.
Thank you, Robin. So we have a number of questions in the chat, and
oh no, Karen's been muted. Karen, come back to us.
I'm back. There I am. Okay. So ready to start questions. So someone asked about the history of Meyer lemons in your book Sourdough, and if that's actually factual.
It is. That's a great question. And I can actually read, for folks who don't know, I'll tell the story very briefly because it's just a little thumbnail, but it's perfect. Yeah, Meyer lemons are a great example of that sort of, I think, humility and recognizing that some of the things we think of as so essential are in fact completely bonkers and alien. So the Meyer lemon, which of course, stalwart of the East Bay, I have a Meyer lemon tree in my yard and I love it. The Meyer lemon comes to us from an expedition, someone named Frank Meyer, part of a very kind of, this is kind of before Reber's time, but some of that same spirit, a real crusading sense of improvement. Like, I've got an idea. Let's send people all across the earth to find the best plants and bring the best plants here. We deserve the best plants. So they really did this. This was a thing that the USDA funded, these trips everywhere. And Frank Meyer was one of the people they sent on these trips. From all reports, kind of an Indiana Jones of plant science. And he found the Meyer lemon tree in China. He did a deal to get some little saplings. Of course, it was at that time a tricky thing to send them back, but send them back he did. It was in fact one of the last things he did, because shortly after that he was killed in mysterious circumstances on a barge in the Yangtze River. So when you think about your Meyer lemon tree and how it's just the most perfect, comfortable thing, know that it is basically the result of a international espionage mission, and it really shouldn't be here. And I think those kind of stories are important to know.
That's great. Okay, thank you.
And it is real, all real. It's all real.
Deidre mentioned regarding the sunken ships that there's a lovely exhibit about them at the Exploratorium in Gallery 6 of the Bay Observatory.
Well, that's great. I'm glad. I didn't know that. I haven't been to the Exploratorium in a long time. But I'm glad to know it, and I'm glad to for the whole audience here to know it as well. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And then Karen Butter, let me find it. Sorry, I just moved my screen too fast. Karen Butter, that there's a story about a ship hull that's buried in a lagoon at Bay Farm Island. So right here in Alameda.
I mean, it really is, and they keep finding more of them. Of course, it's a weird thing to find. It's not like a ship. Some of these things have decomposed and in some sense are barely distinguishable from the surrounding soil. But even so, they do keep finding them. It's awesome. Ghosts in the basement of the Bay Area.
Yes. So David says on your map of that you had for Sourdough, it's a location of Cafe Candide. Reminds him a lot of where Chez Panisse is, and wonders if that's a coincidence.
No, that is not. Of course, that's not a coincidence. Yeah. It's that's so yeah. In the novel Sourdough, for those who haven't read it, there's a very important location and a character associated with it called Cafe Candide. And if you read the book, you will get the sneaking suspicion that it might be based on a real place in North Berkeley that's very famous. So of course it is based on that place. One of the things that I think is so fun to do in fiction writing specifically is to actually pick and choose what you reflect kind of transparently and then what you transform or mutate. Because of course, I didn't give Alameda a different name and say it's the island of, Avalon. No, Alameda's Alameda, and there's plenty of other things, real people and places and institutions in the novel that are just documentary in a sense. But this one, because it's very important to the story, and because frankly, I just wanted to have fun with it and kind of reflect on it and almost show it in a funhouse mirror way, I took that underlying reality, to just shape an east, but then I sort of transformed it. I think of it often as this knob, and the knob is like weirdness or hyper reality. And you got to be careful because things can get too weird. But it turns out if you just turn it up a little bit, the effect can be very interesting and frankly just fun to read. So, yes.
Do you have to have someone check you sometimes on the weirdness?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yes, that's the great virtue of editing. Is that they help you. In some cases they just say, you have gone too far. I can tell why this was fun for you, but it's not a good part for the book.
Great. Jeannie mentioned that she said it was such a wonderful story. I think she was referring to your newspaper series. She were talking about them.
I'm glad to hear it. That's great. It was truly, truly, truly a joy. And I think it's, like we're talking on the scale of a lifetime to be able to do something like that and have it printed and know that it was appearing, on people's doorsteps.
That's great. Yeah. Someone asked, did you take writing classes in college, and how did you start writing?
That's a great question. I didn't. There's kind of short to medium answers. I did not take writing classes in college. I was a writer though, even then, not a very good one. And I was definitely one of those writers. It was not uncommon, but I talked about writing a lot more than I actually wrote. I had a little clique of friends. We were all kind of the same way. That proceeded or continued after college. I just was always really interested in it. I was a reader. The public library raised me. My earliest memories and most cherished memories are at the Troy Public Library in Troy, Michigan, where my parents would drop me off and just kind of, I think it was sort of form of childcare sometimes. And I would just scurry happily, first to the kids section, then YA, and then one day I graduated to the adult section, and it was, a major milestone. And ever since those days, it's just been unchanged. I was always interested or curious about well, could I write something? What would it be like for me to be on that shelf with all those other people? I really did not pursue it in a serious way or with any kind of dedication or craft or practice until much, much, much later. And it was after I came to San Francisco. A variety of things conspired, and I met some other people who were kind of interested in the same things, and we were off to the races.
Great. A couple of people are asking what's next. What are you working on for? Yeah.
Well, I'm working on my new novel. I will confess that it took a turn in the last year. And I think that's true for a lot of, it's obviously true for a lot of people's work, but in particular, people's creative work. I've heard a lot of stories and talked to a lot of people who, kind of said, well, last year, 2020 showed me that maybe the thing that I thought was the most important to produce is not, maybe it actually is important to write the thing you really want to write, like an almost existential confrontation on a lot of levels. And I don't know if my turn was quite that existential, but it was a turn. And I did take one novel project I'd been working on for a little while. I put it on the shelf. I might return to it in the future. And I picked up the one I really have wanted to write for a long time. I think people, whenever they hear me talk about those maps in the front of fantasy books or other things, they can detect a deep affection for that genre, for the stories of the fantastic or stories that kind of bridge into other worlds. I read them as a kid and loved them. I read them today and love them. And so what I'm working on now and have made great progress on is a book that's a little bit like that.
Great. We're looking forward to it. When do you think it might be published?
Good question. Well, it doesn't have a publication date yet because it is not done yet. And it will for sure be finished in 2021, whether that'll be in, April or September. Let's see. Everyone, please root for April.
Okay. Just like our taxes, right?
Something like that. No.
Someone asked, they were wondering when Sourdough was set, that the base is a lot more active now than it was set.
Yeah. Oh, that's a wonderful observation. That's something that maybe I was not and actually still am not totally conscious of. And it actually makes me think that I really ought to do a proper sort of reacquainting with the Navy base. I think the place that I've visited most recently in just the past few years is the Almanac Brewery, which I think is very tasty. But I haven't really gotten the lay of the land. in a lot of years. And so the most direct and I think accurate answer to that question is, it is rooted in that encounter I had at the control tower. And so that was at least 10 years ago. And I think that's probably accurate to say it was about 10 years ago. And yeah, so in that way, it's kind of, even though the events of the book actually seem a little more contemporary, I think the Alameda, the fictional Alameda in that story is probably kind of locked around that time. And that's I appreciate that observation.
Great. So someone asked, what was the process of going from a tech company to becoming a writer like? And do you have any advice for those people?
Oh, of course. Yes. Great question. Boy, that is a good question. I mean, there's kind of two ways to talk about it. One is just in terms of, my actual life and happiness and satisfaction with what I do every day. And that's easy. I like this a lot more. However, when I worked at a tech company, I knew that I didn't like it that much. I mean, I could just tell from the earliest days that although there were some things I did like, the fundamental structure of working in an office and honestly collaborating with all those other people was just not what I was supposed to do. It just was not something that brought me like happiness and like was interesting and engaging to me in the way that it clearly was to many of my colleagues. So that transition was just an upgrade, a clear upgrade. However, then this in some ways kind of cuts the opposite direction. I think it's important to say that experience, well, I worked at two companies in San Francisco, and in particular, I spent just not even 2 years at Twitter, the company Twitter. I mean, this was 10 years ago, so a different place, much, much smaller company. I mean, I still think about the conversations I had there, the people I met. I mentioned earlier in my talk, these sort of novelistic characters. And I mean, I worked with some people who were straight out of fiction in there. They just were weird and brilliant and intense and like very peculiar. And that was fantastic. I mean, I really, truly was taking notes, and that stuff's all still in my notes. Much of it has come out onto the page in Mr. Penumbra's 24-hour bookstore and Sourdough. But there's, that's still there in the stew. So to answer the question directly about people thinking about the transition, recognize that those environments, because they are really weird, are great material. And that doesn't mean that you're going to write a short story or a novel about someone who works at a tech company. But it just gives you, I think any real experience, whether it's, I mean, literally anything, being a landscape, architect, or working at a, cannery, or working at Best Buy, or like fixing cars, anything, the real texture of experience and that kind of knowledge is the coin of the realm. You can't get it any other way. So you should make sure to recognize your tech company experience as just that. It's very valuable.
Someone asks, what's it like to write from the point of view of a woman?
That's a great question. I would say, again, kind of two-part answer. One is I was nervous about it. I was about to say it was fraught, but that's not really true. I just was nervous about it because I wanted to do it well. I didn't want it to seem dopey. I didn't want it to be offensive. You just don't you want to do it well, and almost on a pure craft basis. So I was conscious of that. I never really considered doing otherwise, though, just because the very earliest versions of that story always had this main character and this narrator who was a woman. So I just went with it, and I just never even thought like maybe I should rethink this and peel it all back. But then the other part of it, and I'll say, is that on a sort of conscious but also subconscious level, my approach, and I don't know that this is right for everybody. I wouldn't, put this as like this is the great fiction writing lesson. It's just my approach for writing a character of any gender it's just me, or it's a version of me. And so when I was kind of transcribing the thoughts of Lois, who's the narrator and kind of the hero of Sourdough, I wasn't like, well, what does this woman, Lois, think? I was responding naturally and thinking thoughts the way I think them and kind of working through problems the way I work through them. And I think there's actually something true about that. I think it's like people think the same way, it turns out. And they solve problems the same way, and they kind of, tell wry jokes to themselves the same way. And judging by the general reception to the book and people's opinions, it seems to have worked and been satisfactory to most readers. But I was nervous about it.
Okay. Somebody says, this is not a question, But she was born and raised in the Bay Area, and she totally agrees with your theory about the Bay.
I'm glad to hear it. I'm glad to hear it resonates with a real deep Bay Area person.
Yeah. And I promised my one of my book club friends that I would say this for her. She says she really loved Mr. Penumbra's 24-hour bookstore, and she's looking forward to reading more of your books.
Great. I appreciate that. Wonderful. Yeah, there will be more from that world in particular and those characters. It's not the next thing, but in time.
Yeah, great. Daniel says, I find that part of the fun of reading your books is trying to figure out the real from the fiction. As I read the paper version of the books, I find I must keep my phone open to Google and check things out. I did that too, actually.
Oh, that's great. That's honestly, that is among the best and most resonant praise that I can receive. I mean, I love that idea of sort of hanging out in the shadowy border zone between the fantastic and the real. I think it's where I find it the most interesting to read about myself. And so I'm just happy to kind of plant my flag there and hang out. And I will add that experience of kind of augmented reading, of being able to look things up. I mean, it's been a couple decades now that we've sort of been able to do that. But in the timescale of books and reading, that's brand new. And I think that's actually a pretty exciting capability to have, to know as a writer, when you're trying to put in something and maybe it is pretty weird or like very specific or some weird language or a strange reference, to kind of have that understanding as a backstop. Like, hey, if they really get confused, they'll go look it up and that'll be fun. I think it actually transforms those considerations, and I'm happy to be writing in the age of Google.
Great. So someone asked if you have any interest in the train culture of Oakland and Alameda.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I can't claim to be a deep scholar or student of the history or the presently existing infrastructure, but I live right and work right by the train tracks, and so the sort of some of the whistles are quite harmonious, and then others are like decidedly not. But I know them all, and I hear them every day, and I love them. I also still, this is a bit of a cliched feeling, so I apologize, but I, like a billion other people, lament the passing of the streetcars. Of course, they had them here in Oakland, the Key system, and all across the United States. It was a huge part of urban life in the kind of the earlier part of the 20th century. And you can see, I mean, this is, again, everybody knows this, but you can see the scars of or almost like the ghosts, the voids of where the streetcars were in the shapes of all sorts of weird lots and where things come together in an odd way in the East Bay. And boy, I wish they were still here. I really do.
Yeah, many of us do, I think. Yeah. So someone wants to know if you're a bread baker.
Yeah, of course, it must be a sourdough reader. I did title a novel Sourdough, one would expect. Yeah, the answer is I was. For many years I was. I kept my own sourdough starter, which of course is how I learned what a sourdough starter was, and that became the inspiration for that book. So it all literally grew out of that experience. However, and I truly say this with like a bit of shame, I was not a good sourdough bread baker. It made me recognize like the temperament you need to have to do that, and how not my temperament it is. Like, just a real people who bake know this. Like, you have to like kind of be paying attention to what kind of day it is, and like that the moisture and the humidity, and also like that there are actually temperature variations in different places in your kitchen. The world is not like one temperature. And for better and for worse, I usually think the world is one temperature. So I was always at a disadvantage with the bread baking. And I would say that of all the loaves I ever baked over, 4 or 5 years of baking, I don't think any of them were better than like a B- loaf. So eventually I gave it up, and now I'm just happy to buy A++ sourdough from professionals.
Someone asked if, let me find it exactly, I'm sorry, that they hope that you have mushrooms in your novel idea of notebook. And
yeah, of course. Oh, I mean, I'm not going to do it, but I'm tempted to like screen share and open up my notes file and search for mushrooms or like fungus. And you'd be like, it's a lot of weird stuff about fungus. What are you planning there, Sloan? Yes, definitely. Fungus
that could get weird.
Fungus is underrated. I will say that. That'll be my comment. Fungus is hugely underrated.
So you did mention the Ohlone recently in your presentation, and someone's wondering if the Ohlone are going to figure into your future books.
Boy, that is a great question. So I don't know. I don't know if they will or not, but they really ought to. I almost wish they'd framed it more as an imperative, like, Sloan, get your act together. If you are someone who aspires to talk about the Bay Area in some totality, it's got to stretch back. I think like a lot of people, this is not an uncommon trajectory. You're born and your whole life is like, a dot in the universe. And then as you get older, you of course reach forward into the future because you live through those years and you learn more about the world. But then slowly you kind of start to reach back as well. And so, it's a little offset. You're 20 and the past doesn't exist. But something happens in the decades that pass. And you start to become a nerd for things like the history of Oakland rail or the ghost ships in San Francisco. And you push further and further back over time, or I think you ought to push further and further back. And I think that is kind of, it's just part of a process of intellectual and maybe also moral maturation. So maybe that's all to say that I recognize that I have further to go and more to learn and more to integrate. And I would like to, I really would.
Someone wants to push back to when you first started publishing your writing, and if it was difficult for you and how you found the courage to actually.
That's great. That's a great question. It was difficult, but the scenario in which I did it was distinct. It was kind of a sign of the times, and had it not been for that environment, I don't think I would have ever published anything at all. That sounded very abstract. I'll make it concrete. I published online. I published on the internet. I had always been kind of comfortable with the internet in some sense. I felt like I grew up with it. Not the way kids do now, where they're just kind of dropped into it and it's like an ambient, totally connected infosphere surrounds them. I kind of like went step by step. It was the kind of networks that you had to dial into with a modem when I was a kid. And then it was like AOL Instant Messenger when I was in high school. And then it was the early web when I was in college, and it was all crude and weird and slow. Kind of step by step, it kind of grew with me, or I grew with it. And that's true for many people my age, I think. So I had a blog in the early 2000s. And so the concept of just writing stuff and publishing it online for free, freely open to all, kind of knowing that you were taking a chance that maybe people would read it, maybe they wouldn't, that you just kind of had to do a lot with luck and the way that links kind of percolated back and forth. That just all seemed very natural to me. So that's all to say, when I started writing fiction, I just knew that's how I would initially publish it. I knew that's how I would meet my first 10 readers or my first 100 readers over time. Obviously, there are other more traditional routes. People submit stories to magazines, to competitions. Maybe they go straight, from nothing to a publisher, or try to. But that just was never going to be me. And I think it was really important because I felt comfortable in that kind of digital environment. And also, I just, there's the good question of like, are you afraid, or does it make you anxious, or what if nobody reads it? And I think it's kind of important, especially early on, to set up situations in which that can be okay. Because like no one will read it. That's the way that works. There's so much out there. It's the rare and very bizarre case where like a piece of writing comes out of nowhere and is like, must be urgently read by everyone. So yeah, you just gotta lower the stakes. And sometimes that's just kind of telling yourself a story about what you're doing. Sometimes that's the way you frame it. It can be literally the physical or technical way you publish it. But that was so important for me. I mean, I really I had a sense like, oh, I think 10 people read it. Pretty good. Before it was 0. And then from 10, it went to 100. And from 100, it went to 200. And, just this slow growth over years. I mean, this was a process over many years. But then, did that almost like going up a ladder. And at a certain point on that ladder, there was like writing a full length novel and trying to sell it to a publisher. So I don't know if that answers your question. But.
Well, something else about the books is Daniel says that right after reading the printed version of Mr. Penumbra's, he learned that the audio version has bonus material.
Oh, yeah. This is very important. I'm sure there are very ardent audiobook listeners in the chat, because there just are a lot of ardent audiobook listeners these days. very important medium for reading, systematically underrated, not by the publishing industry, which I think gets it, but I would say by authors. I think mostly, I'm generalizing, and so I apologize if I'm wrong or some particular author is offended, but I would say generally authors, they think about the book, they think about the print book, and only secondarily, like really, really late in the process, does their attention and their creativity perhaps turn to the audiobook. And so, I mean, that was true for me. I didn't think about it at all when I was writing the first draft. But then when it did become part of the process, I'm grateful to the audiobook team at Macmillan and my editor, because we all kind of huddled and said, like, can we do anything to make it interesting? And of course, we kind of had to in a reflexive way, because people who have read the novel know that, I won't spoil it, but one of the plot points actually hinges on something being hidden in an audiobook. There's kind of a secret waiting there only in the audio version of a novel. So you can't put that in the story and then not do it in the audiobook. So we did.
Do you recommend people listen to the audiobook or the written book, the printed book first?
Oh, what a good question.
They're going to do one or the other.
One, yeah, no. I mean, plenty of people have done both, which I find very impressive. Well, I would say the audiobook. I really would. The audiobook is not my home medium. I'm just not a big kind of audiobook listener. I've listened to a few almost as homework to kind of understand it myself. But I love reading a printed book, and I love, reading words on a page. But the actor, reader, narrator who does the Mr. Penumbra's 24-hour bookstore audiobook, his name is Ari Fliakos, and he's an absolute knockout. He just does it so well. I mean, he elevates the material. He does an amazing job. His characterization is impeccable. It's awesome. It's just a wonderful piece of work. So yeah, that's the one I say that's the winner.
Okay, great. Carol mentioned that the key system that we talked about earlier actually crossed the bay on the lower deck of the Bay Bridge when the Bay Bridge was built.
That is right. Yep. Yeah. And before that, prior to the Bay Bridge, they went out on these amazing long kind of moles, and you take a train like kind of halfway across the bay, at which point you would step onto a ferry and continue your journey, which sounds pretty dreamy to me.
Alameda had a mole, by the way.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
See, we're all. I'm like, yes, my local history phase of life has begun. Right. It's very exciting.
Jennifer says, I love the faces in the loaves. I bake sourdough, and about 1 in 4 is not gummy when I'm done.
Yeah.
I make more with discard than proper loaves. Just had a sourdough waffles today.
Let me just say that is the sourdough truth. I feel like maybe all the sourdough bakers of the world need to just like actually admit that is what it's really for. So for us, it's sourdough pancakes. I love sourdough pancakes, but yes, I guarantee you, of my own creation, I have been both nourished and pleased 10 times more by those sourdough pancakes than that.
Yeah.
Bread. I'm there with you.
Betsy asked, do you envision a future destination for yourself beyond the Bay Area?
No, I don't envision it. I mean, nothing is impossible. But boy, I don't know what scenario that would be. Well, no, I do know. If I ran out of money and couldn't afford to live here in some way. That actually, I know. Yeah. In all seriousness, I think that's the real pressure of the Bay Area. I mean, of course, it's got its natural beauty, and then to that we add the incredible sort of culture and all the things that we've talked about today, and then sort of weighed against that, we do have this just incredible cost. I won't go into all the housing stuff, but I think really it's a deep sort of reluctance, and I don't know. I think there's a lot of people in the Bay Area at many different times of its history who have wanted to stop that clock right at the moment when they moved in. So many people pay the price for that. So if I did move out, it would be because I couldn't afford it. But let's just say that doesn't happen, and I'm able to remain happy where I am now. I both continue to be deeply inspired by the Bay Area, and also truly at this point, I feel indebted to it. I mean, the things that I've absorbed here have gone into these books, which have become my life. And so, I mean, maybe this is a little, I don't know, abstract or something, but I would feel a little shoddy, like just saying, thanks for the ideas, I'm off to Paris. Like, no, you got to pay it back. You got to pay back into that system because it's given me so much.
Well, Robin, thank you so much for sharing your evening with us today. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight. We have many more great programs coming up soon, so I'd like to tell you about a few of them. On Wednesday, February 24th, we have a docent program about the art from the African American South. And on Saturday, March 6th, Zheng Chang will be joining us from London. She's the author of Wild Swans, and her recent book is Big Sister, Little Sister, Red Sister. Just want to make note that event will be at 11 a.m. because of the time difference. So you can find all of our upcoming programs on our website at alamedafriends.com. While you were there, please consider making a donation so we can continue bringing you events like this. I want to make a special thank you to the people who helped make this happen today, David Beal, Karen Butter, and Karen Roman, and a special thank you to Robin Sloan for a fun, entertaining, and informative program. Finally, thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. Good night.